The transport shuttle shook violently as it dropped through the thick clouds of Varkos Prime, and Jake Morrison held onto the safety straps with both hands while his commanding officer Victor Hayes sat across from him, looking calm and collected like he always did. They had worked together for 7 years, and Jake trusted Victor with his life, which made what was about to happen even more tragic. The mission briefing had been simple enough, and they were supposed to survey an old outpost on this deadly planet and retrieve some ancient technology that might be valuable to the Coalition. Varkos Prime was classified as a Category 9 Deathworld, and that meant it was one of the most dangerous places in known space, with acid rain and deadly creatures and ground that could split open without warning. Jake had questioned why only 2 people were being sent to such a hostile environment, but Victor had assured him that everything was approved at the highest levels, and that they would be in and out quickly. The shuttle landed hard on the rocky surface and kicked up clouds of toxic dust that swirled around them like angry spirits. Jake checked his environment suit one more time and made sure all the seals were tight, because even a small breach would let in the corrosive atmosphere that could burn through flesh in seconds. Victor stood up and grabbed his equipment pack and motioned for Jake to follow him out of the shuttle. The outpost was about 200 meters away, and it looked more intact than the briefing photos had shown. The metal walls were corroded and covered in strange growths, but the basic structure seemed solid. Jake felt his unease growing as they approached the entrance, because something about this whole situation felt wrong, but he pushed the feeling aside and focused on the mission. They entered through a partially collapsed doorway, and their suit lights cut through the darkness inside and revealed a large chamber filled with equipment and supplies. Jake expected to find ancient ruins or maybe some broken technology, but what he saw instead made him freeze in place. The room was full of weapons, and not old artifacts, but modern military hardware, including plasma rifles and fusion grenades, and what looked like experimental combat armor, still in sealed containers. These were Coalition weapons, and some of them were marked with classification codes that Jake recognized as highly restricted. He turned to Victor to ask what was going on, but the words died in his throat when he saw the plasma pistol in his commander's hand. Victor's face was visible through his helmet visor, and he looked almost sorry about what he was about to do. Nothing personal, Jake, but these weapons are worth more than both our careers combined, and the Coalition doesn't need to know they exist, and neither do you. Jake tried to move, but Victor was faster and brought the pistol down hard on the back of Jake's helmet. The impact sent Jake sprawling forward, and his helmet cracked against the metal floor with a sound that echoed through the empty outpost. Pain exploded through his skull, and his vision blurred, and he could taste blood in his mouth. He tried to get up, but his body wasn't responding properly, and he could only watch helplessly as Victor stood over him. The black market will pay a fortune for this stuff, and Victor said as he checked the weapons cache, and all I had to do was find someone expendable to bring along and make it look like an accident. You were always too honest, Jake, and too much of a Boy Scout, and that's why you'll never get ahead in this galaxy. Victor raised the plasma pistol and aimed it at Jake's chest. The shot tore through Jake's environment suit right below the ribs, and the pain was indescribable. But worse than the pain was the feeling of the atmosphere rushing in through the breach. The corrosive air of Varkos Prime began eating away at his exposed skin, and it felt like he was being burned alive from the inside. Victor sealed some of the weapons in a transport container and activated an emergency beacon that would bring the shuttle to his location. He looked down at Jake one last time and shook his head. Sorry it had to be this way, and you were a good soldier, but business is business. Then he was gone, and the sound of his footsteps faded into silence, and Jake was alone in the darkness, with his life bleeding out onto the cold metal floor. The pain was overwhelming, and every breath felt like inhaling fire, and he could feel his consciousness slipping away. His suit's automatic systems were trying to seal the breach, but the damage was too severe, and the atmospheric contamination was spreading through his body. Jake thought about his life and about all the missions he had survived and all the close calls he had walked away from. He had fought in 3 different war zones and faced down enemies that would have broken lesser men, and survived things that should have killed him a dozen times over. But none of that mattered now, because he was going to die alone on a planet where no one would ever find his body, and Victor would return to base as a hero and probably get promoted for completing the mission under difficult circumstances. The injustice of it all made Jake angry, but the anger couldn't sustain him, and his vision was fading to black, and his breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. His last thought before darkness took him was that he hoped Victor would at least have the decency to feel guilty about this, but he knew that was unlikely. Victor was the kind of man who could justify anything if it benefited him, and he would sleep soundly knowing he had murdered his friend for profit. Jake's eyes closed and his body went limp, and the outpost fell silent except for the distant howling of Varkos Prime's eternal winds. But somewhere deep in his chest and beneath the burns and the blood and the broken ribs, his heart still beat. It was weak and irregular, but it was beating. And Jake Morrison was not quite dead yet, and the planet that was supposed to be his grave had other plans for him entirely. Pain dragged Jake back to consciousness, and it was the kind of pain that made him wish he had stayed in the darkness. His chest felt like it was on fire, and every breath sent sharp agony through his ribs, and his skin burned where the atmosphere had touched it. He forced his eyes open and saw he was still in the outpost, lying in a pool of his own blood, and the dim emergency lights cast everything in a sick yellow glow. His suit had managed to seal the breach, but the damage was already done, and large patches of skin on his chest and arms were burned away down to the muscle. He tried to move and discovered that even the smallest motion sent waves of agony through his entire body. Jake knew he should be dead, and by all rights he should have died hours ago, but something in him refused to give up. He had always been stubborn, and his instructors at the academy had called it his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, and right now, it was the only thing keeping him alive. He began to drag himself across the floor using his elbows because his legs weren't working properly, and every centimeter was pure torture. There had been a medical station in the corner of the room, and he had noticed it when they first entered, and if he could just reach it, he might have a chance. It took him 20 minutes to cross 10 meters, and by the time he reached the medical station, he was sobbing with pain and exhaustion. His fingers were slick with blood and sweat as he fumbled with the controls and tried to activate the ancient system. For a horrible moment, nothing happened, and then the station hummed to life and recognized his human biosignature. Robotic arms descended from the ceiling and began spraying synthetic skin over his wounds and injecting him with a cocktail of antibiotics and painkillers and cellular regeneration compounds. The pain didn't stop, but it became manageable, and Jake felt his consciousness slipping away again, but this time it was the peaceful darkness of medically induced sleep rather than the cold embrace of death. He woke and slept and woke again over the next 3 days, and each time he was awake for a little longer and felt a little stronger. The medical station kept him alive and patched him back together one layer of tissue at a time, and by the 4th day, Jake was able to sit up without screaming. He assessed his situation with the cold clarity that came from accepting he was probably going to die anyway. He was stranded on one of the most hostile planets in known space, with no way to call for help and limited supplies and injuries that would take months to fully heal. Victor would have reported him dead and destroyed any record of the mission, and no one was coming to rescue him. Jake spent the next week exploring the outpost and cataloging what he had to work with. The weapons Victor had wanted were still there, including plasma rifles and fusion grenades and several sets of advanced combat armor. There were also military rations that were decades old but still sealed and edible in water, recyclers that still functioned, and most surprisingly, a small fabrication unit that could produce basic tools and equipment parts. The technology was old and clearly not human in origin, but it all still worked, which suggested whoever built this place had intended it for long-term survival operations. He established a routine because routine was what kept soldiers sane in impossible situations. Every morning he checked his wounds and changed the synthetic skin bandages and exercised as much as his healing body would allow. He repaired his environment suit using parts from the fabrication unit and reinforced the weak points with scraps of metal from the outpost. He ventured outside for short periods and mapped the immediate area around the outpost and learned to read the warning signs of the planet's deadly weather patterns. The acid storms came every 7 days like clockwork, and the ground quakes followed a predictable cycle based on the position of Varkos Prime's 3 moons. The planet was trying to kill him every moment of every day, but Jake discovered that Varkos Prime followed rules like everything else. The predators hunted at certain times and avoided other times, and they had territories they defended and paths they followed. The acid rain was most dangerous in the valleys but less severe on high ground. The temperature fluctuations were extreme but predictable, and if you paid attention you could find safe zones and shelter before the worst conditions hit. Jake began to understand that survival here was not about being stronger or tougher than the planet, but about being smarter and more adaptable. 6 months passed, and Jake had transformed from a dying man into something harder and more dangerous. His body had healed and the scars from his wounds were thick and ropey, but he was stronger than he had been before. The constant struggle to survive had stripped away everything soft about him and left only muscle and bone and iron will. He had killed his first predator at 3 months when a creature he later learned was called a razorback had attacked him during a supply run. He had killed it with a plasma rifle and then dragged its corpse back to the outpost and studied it to learn its weaknesses. One day, while exploring a collapsed section of the outpost, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath layers of debris were data storage cores and ancient devices that somehow still held power after what must have been thousands of years. He spent weeks carefully extracting them and connecting them to the outpost's computer systems and decoding the information they contained. What he found was both fascinating and useful, and the outpost was not human in origin at all, but had been built by a race called the Krell who had vanished from the galaxy 3,000 years ago. They had been warriors and they had used Varkos Prime as a training ground where they sent their soldiers to be forged in the harshest conditions imaginable. More importantly, the data cores contained maps and detailed maps showing the locations of dozens of other outposts scattered across the planet's surface. Jake studied them carefully and traced routes between the locations and calculated distances and risks. One outpost in particular caught his attention because, according to the ancient records, it contained a long-range communication array that might still be functional. It was 300 kilometers away across some of the most dangerous terrain on the planet, but it represented something Jake had not felt since Victor's betrayal, and it represented hope. Getting there would be incredibly dangerous, and probably suicidal, but Jake had already survived. What should have killed him, and he could survive a little longer, and he would get to that communication array, and he would contact the coalition, and he would make Victor Hayes pay for what he had done. Jake spent 2 months preparing for the journey, and he knew that rushing would get him killed, so he took his time and did everything right. He upgraded his environment suit with technology salvaged from the Krell systems, and reinforced the armor plating, and improved the air filtration, and added extra power cells. He fabricated new weapons by combining human and alien designs and created a plasma rifle that was more powerful and more reliable than anything the Coalition produced. He trained every day and pushed his body to its limits and beyond because he knew the journey ahead would test every bit of strength and skill he possessed. 1 year after Victor's betrayal, Jake Morrison set out across Varkos Prime toward the communication array. He moved at dawn when the temperature was coolest and the predators were least active, and he followed the routes marked in the ancient Krell maps. The first outpost was 30 kilometers away and on a normal planet that would have been an easy 2-day trek, but on Varkos Prime, it was a death march through hell. The terrain was a nightmare of jagged rocks and boiling pools of sulfur and toxic gas vents that could kill in seconds. His upgraded suit handled most of the environmental hazards, but Jake still had to navigate carefully and choose each step with absolute precision. On the second day, Jake encountered his first serious obstacle when a pack of 6 razorbacks detected his movement and began stalking him across the broken landscape. He had studied these creatures for months and knew their behavior patterns, but facing them in the open was different from observing them from safety. They were 2 meters tall at the shoulder with 6 legs and armored hides that could deflect small arms fire, and jaws that could crush steel. Jake found a defensible position between 2 large rocks and waited for them to attack, and when they came, he was ready. The first razorback lunged at him, and Jake fired his plasma rifle, and the superheated bolt punched through its armor and dropped it instantly. The others attacked as a coordinated pack and tried to flank him from multiple directions, but Jake had fought in enough battles to recognize the tactic. He rolled under slashing claws and fired point-blank into an open mouth, and used the terrain to funnel them into killing zones where his weapons were most effective. When it was over, 5 razorbacks lay dead and Jake was breathing hard but uninjured. He did not celebrate because this was just the beginning, and there would be many more fights before he reached his destination. The second outpost was more intact than his home base, and Jake found additional supplies and more advanced weapons and another data core that contained something unexpected. The Krell had left behind complete combat training programs and military education systems designed to be used in the field. Jake stayed at the second outpost for 2 weeks and absorbed everything the programs could teach him. Advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques that used an opponent's strength against them, and strategic thinking exercises that taught him to see 3 moves ahead and weapon systems he had never imagined existed. The Krell were brutal instructors even in digital form, but Jake was a dedicated student and he learned quickly. At the third outpost 40 kilometers further into the wasteland, Jake found something that changed his entire mission. He found life and not mindless predators but sentient beings who could speak and reason and fight. They called themselves the Forgotten, and they were descendants of Krell warriors who had been stranded on Varkos Prime generations ago when their civilization collapsed. They had adapted to the planet and evolved with it, and become something neither fully Krell nor entirely changed by their environment. There were 47 of them living in a fortified settlement, built into a massive cave system that protected them from the worst of the planet's fury they surrounded. Jake with weapons drawn, and their eyes were hard and suspicious because strangers on Varkos Prime were usually dead strangers. Their leader was a massive warrior named Krell, who had scars covering half his face and arms like tree trunks. He studied Jake's armor and weapons with obvious recognition, and finally spoke in a deep voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "You have accessed the old training systems, and no outsider has done this, and the planet should have killed you months ago." Jake met his gaze steadily, and replied that the planet had tried very hard to kill him, but he was harder to kill than he looked. Krell. Var studied him for a long moment, and something in Jake's eyes must have satisfied him, because he slowly lowered his weapon. "The old stories speak of this, and they tell of a warrior from the stars who would be forged by Varkos Prime itself, and perhaps you are that warrior. Tell me, human, what is your purpose here?" Jake told them everything about Victor's betrayal and his survival, and his quest to reach the communication array. When he finished, the assembled Forgotten were silent, and Jake could see them weighing his words and deciding whether to believe him or kill him. Krell. Var finally broke the silence, and his voice was firm with decision. "Your enemy wronged you, and honor demands justice, and we know where the communication outpost lies, and we will help you reach it." Jake was surprised by the offer, and asked why they would help a stranger when they owed him nothing. The Krell leader bared his teeth in what might have been a smile, and explained that his people had been forgotten by the galaxy and trapped on this death world for generations. If Jake could reach the communication array and contact his people, then perhaps he could take the Forgotten with him when he left. They had been stranded long enough, and they wanted to see the stars again. Jake looked at the gathered warriors and saw the hope and desperation in their eyes, and he understood what they were offering. They would risk their lives to help him reach his goal if he promised to help them escape their prison. It was a fair trade, and one that appealed to Jake's sense of justice, because these people had been abandoned just like he had been. He made his decision quickly and offered his hand to Krell in the human gesture of agreement. "Help me get home, and I swear I will return for you, and I will take every last one of you off this planet." Krell. Var gripped his hand with enough force to crack bones, but Jake did not flinch, and the two warriors understood each other perfectly. They would face the dangers of Varkos Prime together and either succeed together or die together. The Forgotten erupted in cheers, and Jake found himself surrounded by warriors who had survived impossible odds and who saw in him a chance for salvation. That night they held a feast and shared stories of survival and combat, and Jake learned that he was not alone in his suffering. The galaxy had forgotten many people and many races, and Varkos Prime had become their shared prison. But now they had hope, and they had a plan, and most importantly, they had each other. The journey to the communication array took 3 months. And with Krell and his warriors, Jake crossed territories he could never have survived alone. They traveled through the burning wastes where the ground itself was molten and the heat was intense enough to melt most metals, and they had to time their crossing during the brief cool periods when the volcanic activity decreased. They navigated the crystal forests where massive formations of razor-sharp minerals grew from the ground like giant blades, and one wrong step could slice through armor like paper. They endured the eternal storm in the northern hemisphere, where winds exceeded 300 kilometers per hour, and lightning struck the ground every few seconds. Along the way, they found more survivors, and Jake began to realize that Varkos Prime was not just a death world, but a dumping ground for the inconvenient and the unwanted. A small colony of Threxian traders whose ship had crashed decades ago, and who had been surviving through ingenuity and determination. A group of human miners who had been abandoned by their corporate employers when the mining operation became unprofitable, and the company decided it was cheaper to leave them than to mount a rescue. Even a few Zarnathi warriors who had been exiled to Varkos Prime as punishment for crimes against their government and who had been expected to die within days but had instead thrived in the harsh conditions. Jake brought them all together, and he saw that each group had skills and knowledge that the others needed. The Forgotten Krell taught combat techniques that had been refined over generations of fighting for survival. The Threxian traders contributed their deep understanding of technology and their ability to repair and modify almost any equipment. The human miners knew logistics and resource management, and how to make supplies stretch far beyond their intended limits. The Zarnathi warriors understood tactics and strategy, and could plan complex operations with military precision. Jake synthesized all of it and combined human, military doctrine with alien methodologies, and created something entirely new and something the galaxy had never seen before. By the time they reached the communication outpost, Jake commanded a force of nearly 300 warriors from a dozen different species. They were not a traditional army with uniforms and ranks and formal structure, but they were bound together by shared suffering and mutual respect and absolute loyalty to the man who had given them hope. They had all been betrayed or abandoned or left to die, and Jake understood their pain because he had experienced it himself. He treated them not as subordinates but as equals and as brothers and sisters who had survived the unsurvivable, and that earned him devotion that no amount of military discipline could create. The communication outpost was built into the side of a mountain and protected by Krell engineering that had lasted for thousands of years. The ancient technology was still functional and still generating power from geothermal sources deep underground. Jake approached the control panel with hands that trembled slightly because he had dreamed of this moment for so long. He activated the long-range transmitter and sent out a signal to the nearest coalition relay station and then waited for a response. 6 hours passed while the signal traveled through space, and Jake spent the time checking and rechecking his evidence and preparing what he would say. When the response finally came, it was not what Jake expected, and a stern female voice identified herself as Admiral Helen Carter of the Coalition 4th Fleet and demanded identification. Jake transmitted his service codes and stated his name and rank and waited for the inevitable shock. There was a long pause, and when Admiral Carter spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled and neutral. "Captain Morrison, your death was confirmed 18 months ago, and Commander Hayes reported that you were killed in action during a classified mission, and he received a commendation for completing the mission. Objectives under difficult circumstances." Jake felt white-hot rage surge through him, but he kept his voice level and professional as he explained that Commander Hayes had shot him and left him to die on Varkos Prime. He stated that he had evidence of illegal weapons smuggling and attempted murder, and that he was requesting immediate extraction for himself and his people. Another long pause followed, and Jake could almost hear the political calculations happening on the other end of the transmission. When Admiral Carter spoke again, there was a note of calculation in her voice that told Jake everything he needed to know about how the Coalition viewed his inconvenient survival. The Admiral explained that the situation was complicated because Commander Hayes was now a decorated war hero with powerful political allies, and sending a rescue mission to restricted space would be difficult to authorize. Jake understood what she was really saying, and the Coalition did not want the scandal of a murder investigation, and it was easier to leave him on Varkos Prime and pretend he had never contacted them. The galaxy's powers had been using this planet to dispose of problems for generations, and Jake and his warriors were just more problems that needed to stay buried. Jake looked at Krell, who stood beside him listening to the exchange, and the massive warrior nodded slowly with understanding. Jake made his decision and spoke clearly into the transmitter. "Admiral, I am not requesting rescue, and I am informing you that I am leaving this planet with approximately 300 soldiers, and we will arrive at Coalition space in approximately 6 months, and we will be heavily armed. I strongly suggest you have Victor Hayes waiting for us, and I suggest you have some very good lawyers standing by because I intend to see justice done." Admiral Carter tried to assert her authority and ordered Jake to stand down and wait for proper channels to be followed, but Jake was done following orders from people who had abandoned him. He looked at the warriors who had gathered around the communication station and who were listening to every word, and he thought about everything they had survived together. "With respect, Admiral, the man you are talking to died on this planet 18 months ago, and the person speaking to you now is someone else entirely, and someone you do not want as an enemy. We are coming home and nothing you say or do will stop us." Jake cut the transmission before the Admiral could respond, and the assembled warriors erupted in cheers that echoed through the ancient outpost. Krell clasped Jake's shoulder with a grip that would have broken bone if not for the armor, and spoke with obvious satisfaction. "Well spoken, brother. And now we must figure out how to actually leave this world, because I suspect the Admiral will not make it easy for us." Jake smiled for the first time in months and replied that he had an idea about that, but Krell was not going to like it. The massive warrior laughed and said he had survived Varkos Prime for his entire life and nothing. "Could be worse than that," Jake pulled up data from the ancient Krell records and displayed it on a holographic projector. Deep in the most dangerous region of the planet was the crashed remains of a Krell battlecruiser that had been carrying an invasion force when their civilization fell. The ship was 3 kilometers long and built to survive planetary assault conditions, and according to the data, it was still generating power after thousands of years. If they could reach it and repair enough systems to achieve orbit, they might have a way off the planet. Krell studied the data and looked at the location marked in the deepest part of the abyssal trench, and shook his head with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "You are insane human, and I knew I liked you for a reason." The abyssal trench was the single most dangerous location on Varkos Prime, and it was a massive valley that dropped 15 kilometers below the surface, where the atmospheric pressure was crushing and the temperature was hot enough to melt most common metals. The ancient Krell battlecruiser had crashed there during their civilization's final days, and most of its crew had died on impact, but the ship itself had been built to survive orbital bombardment and planetary invasion, so it remained mostly intact. Jake led his army toward the trench, knowing that many of them would not survive the descent, but also knowing they had no other choice. They descended in stages and allowed their environment suits to adjust gradually to the increasing pressure, because a too rapid descent would kill them as surely as any predator. The walls of the trench were steep and unstable and covered in toxic minerals that could burn through armor if touched directly. Jake's force moved slowly and carefully, and used climbing equipment fabricated from Krell technology, and they lost 3 warriors in the first day when a rock slide swept them into the depths below. Everyone knew the risks, but no one suggested turning back, because they had all come too far to give up. Now, the deeper they went, the more hostile the environment became, and they encountered creatures that lived in the extreme conditions at the bottom of the trench. Spined serpents that were 10 meters long with bodies covered in razor-sharp scales and venom that could dissolve metal. Magna worms that burrowed through solid rock and attacked anything that generated heat. Swarms of smaller creatures that Jake had no name for, but which could strip flesh from bone in seconds if they got past the armor. The warriors fought constantly, and the Zarnathi proved their worth by organizing defensive formations, and the Krell showed why they had once been feared across the galaxy as they tore through enemies with brutal efficiency. After 5 days of descent, they reached the valley floor and found their prize half buried in cooling lava but still recognizable as a ship. The Krell battlecruiser was enormous, and 3 kilometers of armored hull stretched before them like a metal mountain. Jake's scanners detected power signatures deep within the ship, and that meant the main reactor was still functional after thousands of years. The Threxian engineers were excited, and already discussing how they could access the ship's systems and bring it back to life. They had performed miracles with ancient technology before, but this would be their greatest challenge yet. They spent 2 months excavating and repairing the ship, and every day was a battle against both the environment and the predators that called the trench home. The engineers worked around the clock and coaxed dead systems back to life and jury-rigged repairs that combined 3 different technological traditions. The human miners used explosives and heavy equipment to clear away the hardened lava that encased parts of the hull. The Zarnathi established a defensive perimeter and held off constant attacks from creatures drawn by the noise and activity. The Forgotten Krell accessed the ship's ancient computer cores and extracted navigation data and operational protocols. Jake coordinated everything and worked 20-hour days and pushed himself harder than he had ever pushed before. He knew they had limited time because the Coalition would be monitoring Varkos Prime now, and eventually they would send someone to investigate. More warriors died during the repair work, and crushed by falling debris or killed by predators or succumbing to the extreme environmental conditions. Each death weighed on Jake, but he could not afford to stop and mourn, because stopping meant failure, and failure meant everyone would die. On the 73rd day, the lead engineer came to Jake with cautiously optimistic news, and the ship was as ready as it would ever be. The main engines were functional at about 60% capacity, and life support was operational in most sections, and the hull integrity was questionable in places, but would probably hold during atmospheric exit. Probably was not a word Jake wanted to hear, but it was the best they could do with the time and resources available. He called together his command staff and explained the situation plainly, and the ship would either fly or it would explode, and either way they would not be staying on this planet any longer. The launch was violent and terrifying, and the ancient ship groaned and shuddered as its engines fired. For the first time in millennia, alarms screamed throughout the vessel, and warning lights flashed in a dozen colors, and hull breaches vented precious atmosphere into the toxic air outside. Jake stood on what passed for a bridge and gripped the command console as the ship lifted meter by meter from its grave. The ascent seemed to take forever, and they climbed out of the abyssal trench while the hull temperature climbed to dangerous levels and structural supports creaked. Under stress they were never designed to handle. They broke through the cloud, layering into open sky, and Jake allowed himself a moment of triumph because they had done the impossible. 300 survivors had entered the deadliest place on the deadliest planet in known space, and excavated a starship and brought it back to life through sheer determination. The warriors throughout the ship were cheering and embracing each other, and some were crying with relief. But Jake's attention was focused on the sensor displays because something was wrong and proximity alarms were beginning to wail. 6 Coalition warships appeared on the scanners, and they were arranged in a blockade formation around Varkos Prime. Admiral Carter's voice came over the communication channel, and it was hard and commanding. Unidentified vessel. This is Coalition 4th Fleet, and you are in restricted space, and you will power down your engines immediately and prepare to be boarded, or we will open fire. Jake looked at his command staff and saw determination on every face, and they had not come this far to surrender now. He asked the Zarnathi tactical officer if they could fight the Coalition ships and the aliens. Eyes gleamed with cold calculation as he studied the sensor data. The Zarnathi explained that their ship had been designed to invade planets and break through orbital defenses, and yes, they could fight the Coalition vessels and probably win, but it would be costly. Jake thought about everything he had survived, and about his people who had trusted him, and about Victor Hayes, who was probably watching from safety somewhere thinking he had won. He opened a channel to Admiral Carter and spoke clearly and calmly. Admiral, I do not want to fight you, but I will if I have to, and I have 300 warriors who have survived hell itself, and we have a ship that was built to destroy worlds, and we have absolutely nothing left to lose, Jake continued, and his voice grew harder with each word. You can try to stop us, but I guarantee you will regret it, and some of your ships will not be going home, and the survivors will tell stories about the day they fought the Forgotten Legion. Think carefully, Admiral, because I am giving you a chance to let us pass peacefully. But if you fire one shot, I will treat it as an act of war. The communication channel went silent, and Jake watched the Coalition ships on his sensors and saw their weapon systems powering up, and his own crew tensed and prepared for battle. Then slowly and reluctantly the Coalition ships began to move aside and create an opening in their blockade formation. Admiral Carter's voice came back over the channel, and it was tight with suppressed anger. You have passage to Coalition space, Captain Morrison. But when you arrive, there will be consequences, and do you understand? Jake smiled grimly and replied that he was counting on consequences because he intended to make sure everyone knew what Victor Hayes had done and what the Coalition had tried to cover up. The ancient Krell battlecruiser accelerated toward open space and left Varkos Prime behind, and in the command center 300 voices raised in celebration because they had escaped the Deathworld and they were finally going home. The journey to Coalition space took 6 months exactly as Jake had predicted, and every day brought new challenges as the ancient ship protested every light year of travel. The engines required constant maintenance, and the hull developed new leaks that had to be patched, and systems that had worked perfectly for weeks would suddenly fail without warning. But the Threxian engineers performed miracles on a daily basis and kept the ship moving forward, and Jake used the time to drill his warriors in space combat and boarding operations because he suspected they would need those skills before this was over. News of their escape had spread through the galaxy faster than light itself, and the story was simply too good for the media to ignore. A human captain betrayed and left for dead on the worst planet in known space who had survived and returned with an army of mixed-species warriors in an ancient warship, and the public loved every detail. The coalition government tried to control the narrative, but Jake had been thorough, and he had sent copies of all his evidence to every major news outlet in the galaxy before they even left Varkos Prime. Recordings from the outpost, showing Victor's betrayal and testimony from his warriors and data recovered from the Krell systems. Victor Hayes had tried to disappear when the news broke, and he called in every favor he had and used all his political connections and attempted to flee to neutral space where coalition law could not reach him. But Jake had anticipated this and had made sure that Victor's face and crimes were known on every inhabited world in the sector. There was nowhere Victor could hide where someone would not recognize him, and the man who had once been a decorated hero was now the most wanted fugitive in coalition space. The authorities eventually caught him, trying to board a transport to the Outer Rim, and he was arrested and held pending Jake's arrival. The coalition offered Jake a deal when his ship was still 2 months from their space, and they proposed that he come in peacefully and submit to debriefing and allow proper legal channels to handle Victor's prosecution. In exchange, his warriors would be granted asylum and citizenship, and the illegal weapons cache would be quietly forgotten, and everyone could move on with their lives. Jake refused the deal immediately because he wanted Victor to face him in person, and he wanted the man who had betrayed him to look into the eyes of the person he had tried to murder, and he wanted it to be public so the whole galaxy could see what happened when you underestimated human determination. This coalition eventually agreed to Jake's terms mostly because they had no good options available, and Jake had become a folk hero to billions of people across dozens of worlds. His warriors were being called the Forgotten Legion, and they had captured the public imagination in a way the government could not control. Any attempt to arrest them or attack them would be a public relations disaster of epic proportions, and the coalition was already dealing with enough scandals without adding another one. So they arranged a trial, and not a quiet military tribunal, but a full public trial with representatives from all the major galactic powers in attendance, and it would be broadcast across 1,000 worlds. Jake arrived at Coalition Central Station with his command staff, and he wore not a dress uniform but the battle-scarred armor he had worn on Varkos Prime because he wanted everyone to see what he had survived. The dents and scratches and burn marks told a story more powerful than any words could, and when he walked through the station corridors, people stopped and stared, and some saluted, and others simply watched with something like awe. Victor was already at the courthouse, flanked by expensive lawyers and looking far less confident than Jake remembered, and the man who had once been so sure of himself now looked small and frightened, and he avoided Jake's eyes. The trial lasted 3 days, and it was broadcast to every corner of known space. Jake testified about the betrayal and described in detail how Victor had shot him and left him to die, and everything he had endured to survive. His warriors testified about their own stories and how they had been abandoned or betrayed by governments and corporations that saw them as disposable. The Forgotten Krell spoke about generations spent trapped on Varkos Prime. The human miners described being left behind when their company decided rescue was too expensive. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, and even Victor's lawyers seemed uncomfortable defending him. On the final day, Victor finally took the stand and tried to justify his actions, and he claimed the weapons were for the greater good and insisted he had believed Jake was already dead when he left the planet. It was obvious to everyone watching that he was lying, and his story changed multiple times and contradicted the physical evidence. When Jake's lawyer played the recording of Victor's own words as he shot Jake, and explaining that this was just business, the courtroom erupted, and the judges had to call for order. Victor's face went pale, and he realized in that moment that he had lost, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. The judges deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict, and they found Victor Hayes guilty on all counts: attempted murder and treason and weapons smuggling and desertion and conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that carried severe penalties. The sentence was life imprisonment with no possibility of parole at a maximum security facility, and Victor would spend the rest of his days locked away with nothing but his regrets for company. Jake watched as security officers led Victor away in restraints, and the man finally looked at him directly, and Jake saw not defiance or anger but defeat and the complete collapse of everything Victor had been After the trial, Admiral Carter approached Jake in the courthouse hallway, and she had been called to testify and had admitted under oath that the coalition had known about the illegal weapons and had tried to cover up the entire incident. She looked tired and older than Jake remembered from their first communication, and the scandal had not been kind to her career. "You got your justice, Captain Morrison, and now what will you do with it?" Jake looked past her to where his warriors were celebrating their victory, and he saw Krelvar and the others who had become his family, and he knew exactly what he would do next. "Now we are going to find everyone else who was left behind," and Jake replied, and his voice was firm with conviction. "Every person the galaxy forgot about or threw away, and we are going to bring them home, and we are going to make sure this never happens again." Admiral Carter studied him for a long moment and seemed to be weighing whether to argue or simply accept what was coming. "That is a large undertaking, Captain, and you will make many enemies among the powerful, and are you prepared for that?" Jake smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, but one hardened by survival and tempered by purpose. "We survived," Varco's Prime Admiral and Jake said quietly, "and everything else is easy in comparison, and I have 300 warriors who agree with me, and we have a warship, and we have nothing left to lose. The powerful have been disposing of inconvenient people for centuries, and someone needs to remind them that every life matters and that the forgotten have long memories." Admiral Carter nodded slowly and seemed to accept that arguing would be pointless. "Then I suppose I will see you again, Captain, and try not to start any wars while you are out there saving people." Jake watched her walk away and knew that his work was only beginning, but he had never felt more certain of his purpose. 1 year after the trial, Jake Morrison stood on the wee bridge of the ship they now called Valiant and looked out at the stars with satisfaction, because his promise to rescue the forgotten had resonated across the galaxy in ways he never imagined. Donations had poured in from worlds that had lost their own people to death. Worlds and abandonments, and the coalition government, embarrassed by the scandal, had quietly provided resources and funding. Even some of the great corporations had contributed money and equipment, eager to distance themselves from the practice of abandoning inconvenient employees, and the Forgotten Legion had grown from 300 warriors to over 2,000. The Valiant had been extensively repaired and upgraded, and now it was one of the most formidable vessels in known space. Threxian engineers had modernized its ancient systems and integrated coalition technology, and human technicians had improved its efficiency and reliability. Zarnathi weapons specialists had enhanced its armaments and turned it into a ship that could fight entire fleets if necessary. But the Valiant was not alone anymore, and Jake now commanded 5 ships and crews drawn from dozens of species, and they had conducted 17 rescue operations across 9 different Deathworlds, and every person they saved joined the Legion and swelled their ranks. They had become more than a military force, and they were a movement that proclaimed loudly that every life mattered, and that no one should be left behind. Governments that had once used Deathworlds as dumping grounds now thought twice before abandoning people, and corporations reconsidered their policies on leaving employees in dangerous situations. The change was not universal, and there were still powers that saw the Legion as a threat to the established order, and there were those who resented Jake's interference in what they considered internal affairs. But the Legion had proven themselves in combat when challenged, and most had learned it was easier to work with them than against them. On this particular day, Jake was reviewing reports from their latest operation, where they had extracted 47 survivors from a mining colony that had been abandoned when the ore ran out. The corporation that owned the colony had claimed evacuation was too expensive and had simply stopped sending supply ships and left the miners to die. The Legion had disagreed strongly with that assessment and had arrived with 3 ships and taken everyone who wanted to leave, and the corporation had threatened legal action but backed down when Jake released the recordings of corporate executives discussing how much money they would save by not mounting a rescue. Krelvar entered the bridge, and the massive warrior had become Jake's second in command and his closest friend and confidant. In the year since leaving Varco's Prime, they had fought side by side in a dozen engagements and saved hundreds of lives together, and their bond was stronger than blood. "Brother, we have a situation," and Krelvar said, using the term they had adopted for each other. "Long-range sensors have detected a distress signal from the Kresh sector," and Jake pulled up the navigation data immediately, because the Kresh sector was deep in contested space where Multiple powers claimed jurisdiction, and none wanted to commit resources. Jake asked for details, and Krell explained that it was a research station funded by the Coalition, but officially disavowed, and they had been studying alien technology when something went wrong. Now the station was contaminated with a biological hazard, and the Coalition had declared it a total loss and refused to send a rescue team. The distress signal indicated 73 survivors trapped inside, but the biological contamination was lethal, and anyone who went in would be exposed. Jake did not hesitate and ordered the ship to plot a course at maximum speed and told the crew to prepare hazard response teams. Var paused, and his expression showed concern because this mission would be dangerous and more dangerous than most of their operations. The contamination was unknown, and they could lose people, and perhaps many people, and was Jake certain this was worth the risk? Jake looked at his friend and brother and spoke firmly. We could lose people, yes, but what is the alternative? And we leave them to die because it is dangerous, and that is what Victor did to me, and that is what the galaxy has been doing to people like us for centuries. And no more, and not while I am alive, Krell. Var's face split in a fierce grin that showed all his teeth, and he understood completely why they all followed. This human who refused to abandon anyone. This is why we follow you, Jake Morrison, and very well, we go to save more forgotten souls, and if Death wants to stop us, then Death will have to work for it. The Valiant turned toward the Kresh sector, followed by its sister ships, and on board 2,000 warriors prepared for their next mission. They were the rejected and the abandoned and the supposedly dead, and they were the people the galaxy had tried to forget. But they had survived, and they had endured, and they had found each other. Jake Morrison had been left for dead on a Deathworld, and he had crawled out of hell itself with nothing but determination and spite. He had built an army from survivors and outcasts and people who had been thrown away like garbage. He had faced down his betrayer in front of the entire galaxy, and won justice for himself and for all the others who had been wronged. But that was just the beginning of his story, and the galaxy was learning that those who survived the impossible could achieve the unthinkable, and that the forgotten would not stay forgotten anymore. As the Valiant entered jump space and raced toward 73 people who needed saving, Jake allowed himself a rare smile. Victor Hayes was in prison where he would spend the rest of his life, and his warriors had found purpose and family and belonging. Somewhere out there were more forgotten souls waiting to be found, and more people who had been abandoned and written off and declared dead. The work would never be finished because there would always be more death worlds and more abandoned outposts, and more people left behind by those with power. But that was fine with Jake because he had found his purpose and he had found his family. In a maximum security prison on Coalition Central, Victor Hayes sat in his cell and watched the news broadcasts showing the Forgotten Legion completing another impossible rescue. The media was calling Jake Morrison a hero of the people and a champion of the forgotten, and Victor realized too late what he had done. He had tried to kill Jake Morrison on a death world and dispose of an inconvenient witness, but instead he had forged something greater and created his own nemesis. Victor had underestimated one crucial fact about humans, and they were stubborn beyond reason and adaptable beyond belief, and when pushed to their absolute limits, they could accomplish things that should have been impossible. The irony was not lost on Victor, as he sat alone with nothing but time and regret, and he had created the very thing that destroyed him. Meanwhile, light years away, Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and looked out at the stars with determination, because somewhere out there were more people who needed saving, more forgotten souls waiting for rescue, and more lives that mattered despite what the powerful believed. He would find them, and all of them, and no matter how long it took or how many enemies he made along the way. That was the promise he had made to himself and to Krell and to every warrior who followed. Him and Jake Morrison always kept his promises. The Forgotten Legion would continue their work, and they would remind the galaxy that every life had value, and that those who were abandoned were not truly forgotten. They had survived hell, and they had come back stronger, and they would never stop fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. This was their purpose and their mission and their gift to a galaxy that had tried to throw them away, and in the end, they would change everything.